Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of rural Kentucky. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the autumn of 1885, the entire Miller family vanished from their homestead in Boone County, Kentucky, without a trace. 5 adults, gone overnight, leaving behind a half-eaten meal, livestock unfed, and doors unlocked. Most peculiar was the dining table, set for 6, though only 5 lived at the residence. For decades, the case remained buried in county records until a historian uncovered a series of journals and correspondence that painted a deeply unsettling picture of what might have transpired during those final weeks at the Miller farm. What follows is based on county records, personal correspondence, church registries, and interviews conducted by Professor Harlan Weathers of Transylvania University between 1954 and 1958, shortly before his own mysterious departure from academic life. The materials were subsequently archived in the university's special collections until 1968, when portions were damaged in a basement flood. What remains tells a story so disturbing that local officials reportedly requested certain documents be sealed from public view. The Miller homestead sat approximately 4 miles northeast of Burlington, the county seat, down what is now known as Miller's Creek Road. In 1885, this was considered remote country, with neighbors sparse and visits to town infrequent, especially during the harsh Kentucky winters. The property consisted of a 2-story farmhouse, a large barn, smokehouse, and several outbuildings, all positioned in a small clearing surrounded by dense woodland that stretched toward the Ohio River. The house itself was built in the traditional Kentucky farmhouse style, a central hallway with rooms on either side, a steep staircase leading to the second floor, and a root cellar dug deep beneath the kitchen. According to land records, the property had been purchased by Thomas Miller in 1872, though local accounts suggest the land had a troubled history even before the Millers arrived. The previous owners, the Dawson family, had departed suddenly after only 8 months of residence, selling the property for significantly less than its assessed value. When questioned by neighbors, they reportedly claimed the soil was poor and the well water brackish. However, subsequent testing of the well by county officials in 1959 revealed nothing unusual about the water quality. In fact, the water was remarkably pure, with mineral content suggesting it drew from a deep, pristine aquifer. Thomas Miller was described in town records as a reserved but respectable man in his early 50s, a widower who had relocated from eastern Pennsylvania with his brother Robert, sister-in-law Martha, and Martha's sister Eliza Spencer. The 5th resident was Thomas's cousin, Samuel Miller, who joined the household in early 1884 after suffering financial reversals in Cincinnati. All were considered well-educated and somewhat separate from the rural community, though they attended the local Presbyterian church with reasonable regularity. Church records indicate Thomas was particularly devout, often staying after services to discuss theological matters with Reverend Stillwell. These discussions, according to the Reverend's personal diary discovered in 1962, often centered on rather esoteric interpretations of Scripture, particularly passages dealing with thresholds, gates, and boundaries between the seen and unseen world. Stillwell noted that while Thomas was clearly intelligent and well-read, some of his interpretations struck him as unnecessarily literal and somewhat discomforting. What transpired on that property over 13 years culminated in one of the most puzzling disappearances in Kentucky history. The facts, as they were initially reported, seemed straightforward. On November 12, 1885, a neighboring farmer named Jeremiah Tanner visited the Miller farm to discuss a potential land purchase. Finding no response to his knocks and noting the unusual sight of unmilked cows in obvious distress, Tanner entered the unlocked house and discovered it empty. Tanner's sworn statement, preserved in county records, described the scene in detail. "I called out several times but received no answer. The house was uncommonly cold inside, though there were ashes in the fireplace suggesting it had been lit not long before. In the dining room, I found the table set for 6 persons, with plates of half-eaten food gone cold. A pot of coffee on the stove was still warm. I checked all rooms of the house and found no sign of the family, though their coats still hung by the door and boots were lined up neatly in the mudroom. The entire situation struck me as unnatural, and I confess to feeling a strong urge to leave the premises immediately. The initial investigation noted several additional peculiarities. A single lantern remained lit in the parlor, its oil nearly depleted. The family's horses remained in the stable, and their only wagon was still in the barn. No personal belongings appeared to be missing, and weather conditions had been clear, ruling out any need for sudden evacuation due to natural disaster. The family Bible lay open on the sideboard to the book of Ezekiel, with certain passages underlined in ink that appeared recent, as it had not fully dried. Sheriff William Collins and 3 deputies conducted a thorough search of the property and surrounding woods, but found no signs of violence or struggle. In his official report, Collins wrote, "We have examined every inch of the house, outbuildings, and adjacent woodland, to a distance of 1 mile in all directions. No blood or signs of violence were discovered. No footprints were found leading away from the property, though recent rainfall may have obscured such evidence. The family's personal documents, including financial papers, remain in the house, ruling out flight due to debt or legal troubles. At present, we can offer no explanation for the disappearance of 5 adults who, by all accounts, were in good standing with the community and had no known enemies. The case was briefly investigated as a possible crime, but with no bodies, no blood, and no clear motive, it was eventually classified as an unexplained disappearance. The property was sold at auction the following spring, and the Miller family became little more than an occasional topic of local speculation. Over the years, various theories emerged that they had joined a religious commune, fled to avoid some scandal, or perhaps met with foul play from travelers passing through the area. None of these explanations gained significant traction, and the mystery gradually faded from local memory. That might have been where the story ended, had it not been for the discovery made 69 years later in the attic of the Burlington County Courthouse. During a renovation in 1954, workers uncovered a sealed wooden box containing a collection of personal papers, including Thomas Miller's journal, several letters between family members, and most disturbingly, a series of pencil drawings that defied simple explanation. The box itself was peculiar, crafted of oak with iron bindings and sealed with wax bearing an unusual symbol that courthouse staff could not identify. How it came to be stored in the courthouse attic remains unknown, though one theory suggests it might have been placed there by Sheriff Collins, who died in 1889, just 4 years after the disappearance. Professor Harlan Weathers, then a young historian specializing in Kentucky rural life, was granted access to these materials. Over the next 4 years, he conducted extensive research into the Miller case, interviewing elderly residents with family connections to the original investigation and cross-referencing church and county records. His findings were compiled into a manuscript that was never published, as Weathers himself disappeared, while on a research trip to the original Miller property in 1958. According to Weathers' notes, which were recovered from his university office, the Miller family's disappearance was preceded by months of increasingly strange behavior and disturbing events that were largely concealed from their neighbors. The journal entries and private correspondence revealed a household descending into paranoia, suspicion, and possibly madness. The first indications of trouble appear in Thomas Miller's journal approximately 6 months before the disappearance. Entries from May 1885 describe unusual sounds emanating from the walls of the house, particularly at night. Initially attributed to mice or raccoons, the noises became a source of significant anxiety as they increased in frequency and complexity. May 17, 1885. The scratching resumed tonight, more persistent than before. Robert insists it is merely animals in the walls, yet it carries a disturbing rhythm at times, almost deliberate. Martha suggests we open the wall in the upper hallway where the sound is most pronounced, but I fear what damage that might do to the structure. For now, we have agreed to place traps in the attic. A week later, Miller wrote, May 24th, 1885. The traps remain unsprung, yet the noises continue. Last night they were loud enough to wake Samuel, who is the soundest sleeper among us. He described it not as scratching, but as a soft tapping, as if someone were attempting to communicate through the wall. I find such notions fanciful, yet I cannot deny the sounds have a certain pattern to them. Eliza has taken to sleeping with cotton in her ears, though she claims she can still hear the tapping even so, as if it bypasses the ear entirely, to use her curious phrase. 2 weeks later, Miller wrote, June 8, 1885. No animals have been caught despite the noises growing louder. Eliza now refuses to sleep alone and has moved her bedding to Martha and Robert's room. Samuel claims to have seen movement in the corner of his eye while in the barn, though nothing is ever there when he turns to look. I find myself growing irritable with their nervousness, yet I too feel a certain unease I cannot properly name. Last night I woke convinced someone was standing at the foot of my bed, though upon lighting the lamp the room was empty. Robert has suggested we consult Dr. Harlow in Burlington about nerve tonics, which may calm our increasingly frayed sensibilities. A receipt from Dr. Harlow's office, dated June 11, 1885, confirms that Thomas purchased several bottles of a common sedative tincture containing valerian and bromide. However, a subsequent entry in Miller's journal suggests the medication provided little relief. The tonic dulls the senses, but does nothing to quiet what causes our unease. If anything, the drowsiness it induces makes us more vulnerable to suggestion. Martha reported a most vivid dream, in which she saw someone sitting in the rocking chair in her bedroom, though the face was indistinct. Upon waking, she found the chair rocking slightly as if recently vacated. According to Weather's analysis, the family's isolation intensified during this period. Church attendance records show they stopped attending Sunday services by late June. The shopkeeper in Burlington noted in his ledger that Thomas Miller began purchasing unusual quantities of candles and lamp oil, far more than a household of 5 would typically require, even accounting for the approaching winter. He also ordered several books from Philadelphia dealing with architecture and building techniques, specifically focusing on insulation and wall construction. A letter from Martha to a cousin in Pennsylvania, dated July 14, 1885, references strange visitations but provides few details. We have had some strange visitations of late that have left us all rather unsettled. Thomas believes there is a natural explanation, though he has yet to discover it. Robert has taken to sleeping in a chair by the front door, shotgun across his lap, though I've told him repeatedly such behavior will only encourage gossip if anyone were to call unexpectedly. I pray this passes before harvest, as we cannot afford to appear unstable before our neighbors. The cousin's reply, found among the papers, expresses concern and makes reference to similar incidents in the family's past. Your description of recent events recalls to mind the troubles your father experienced in the winter of '49, before you were born. He too spoke of noises with no source and presences felt, but unseen. Grandfather believed our family particularly susceptible to certain influences, which was why he was so strict about the placement of doors and windows in a home, and why certain symbols were carved into thresholds. Perhaps Thomas might examine the construction of your Kentucky house with this in mind. Some boundaries, once weakened, invite unwelcome attention. By August, Thomas's journal entries suggest he had begun investigating the structural aspects of the house, particularly the north wall of the cellar, which he described as abnormally cold to the touch even in summer heat. An entry from August 23rd reads, I have discovered an irregularity in the cellar wall that suggests it may have been modified at some point before our purchase of the property. The stonework differs subtly in one section, approximately 6 feet in width. When placed against this section, the compass needle wavers erratically. I have not shared this observation with the others, as their nerves are already overstrained. A subsequent entry, dated September 3rd, describes Thomas's decision to open the wall. After much consideration, I determined to investigate the northern cellar wall. Working alone while the others visited town, I removed several stones and discovered a narrow space beyond, perhaps 10 inches in width, extending upward into darkness. The air that emerged was stale, but carried a peculiar scent I cannot adequately describe. Not unpleasant, but somehow wrong, like fruit that appears perfect, yet tastes subtly spoiled. Most disturbing was the temperature, which was notably colder than the surrounding cellar. I inserted a lantern on a pole but could see little beyond rough stone. Before replacing the stones, I felt compelled to reach into the space. The moment my hand entered, the scratching sounds, which had been absent for several days, immediately resumed throughout the house with such violence that dust fell from the cellar ceiling. I withdrew at once and restored the wall, but I fear I have drawn attention to our awareness. The most revealing documents, according to Weather's notes, were the pages from Thomas Miller's personal journal from September and October 1885. The handwriting grows increasingly erratic, with some entries trailing off mid-sentence or containing crossed-out passages. Several pages contain the same phrase repeated, "It watches from between the walls." An entry from September 23rd reads, "Samuel insists he saw someone watching from the edge of the woods last evening. A tall figure, he said, standing perfectly still among the trees." When Robert took the rifle and went to investigate, no tracks or disturbances were found. Yet this morning I discovered the cellar door standing open, though I am certain I secured it last night. Nothing appears disturbed or missing, but the air down there carried a peculiar stillness, as if something had recently departed. On September 30th, Thomas wrote, "Eliza's condition worsens. She speaks little and stares often at empty corners of rooms. This morning she asked why we had invited the tall man to breakfast, though no visitors have called in weeks. When questioned, she grew confused and claimed not to remember making such a statement. I suggested she might benefit from time away, perhaps visiting her niece in Louisville, but she became extremely agitated at the thought of leaving the house. It wouldn't let me go, she said, though she would not elaborate on what she meant by it." A disturbing entry from October 7th describes escalating phenomena. The incidents now occur in daylight as well. At dinner, all 5 of us observed the dining room door open approximately 4 inches, though no draft existed to explain it. Later, while reviewing accounts in the study, I distinctly heard footsteps in the hallway, though when I emerged, no one was there. Robert claims to have seen a figure reflected in the window glass while shaving, standing behind him, yet he was alone in the room. Most troubling, Martha discovered that someone, or something, had set an additional place at the breakfast table this morning before any of us had risen. By October, the journal entries suggest the family had begun taking extreme precautions, boarding up certain rooms in the house and establishing a system of watches throughout the night. An October 11th entry notes, "We have agreed not to separate under any circumstances. The incident with Eliza yesterday has convinced us all that solitude invites unwanted attention. Martha has suggested we reach out to Reverend Stillwell, but Samuel is vehemently opposed, believing any outsiders will only make our situation worse. I find myself torn, wanting assistance, yet reluctant to invite scrutiny into what might simply be a shared delusion born of isolation. The noises have changed character again, less like scratching now and more like whispering, though in no language any of us recognize." An entry from October 18th refers to an incident that appears to have profoundly affected the family. "It took something from Eliza today. She was alone in the kitchen for perhaps 5 minutes while the rest of us brought in firewood. When we returned, she sat motionless at the table, staring at her hands. She cannot or will not describe what occurred, but she has not spoken since. Most distressing, is the calm that has settled over her, replacing the anxiety of previous weeks. She follows us with her eyes, but seems to look through rather than at us. Samuel believes she has been hollowed out, to use his unsettling phrase. The final dated entry in Thomas Miller's journal, November 10, 1885, just 2 days before the family was discovered missing, contains perhaps the most unsettling passage. It came into full view today, standing at the edge of the north field, watching the house. Robert saw it too, which provides some relief to my sanity. We have decided on a course of action. Samuel believes he knows what it wants. God forgive us for what we must do. What exactly the family had planned remains unknown. The journal ends there, with several blank pages following. However, among the papers was a folded sheet containing a crude map of the property with several locations marked with X's, including one inside the house itself in what appeared to be the cellar, and 4 others forming a rough circle around the property boundaries. Also among the recovered materials was a small notebook in Samuel Miller's handwriting, containing what appeared to be research notes on various historical and folkloric subjects. Many pages focused on ancient beliefs regarding thresholds, boundaries, and methods of containing or repelling unwanted entities. One page contained a detailed drawing of a symbol identical to the one found on the wax seal of the box in which the documents were discovered. Beneath it, Samuel had written, "The doorkeeper's sign, used in old Pennsylvania Dutch homes to seal spaces where the boundary has grown thin, must be made with ink containing blood and iron dust. The symbol creates a door that can be opened or closed at need." In 1956, with permission from the property's then owners, Weathers conducted a limited archaeological investigation of the marked locations on the Miller map. According to his field notes, excavation of the cellar revealed a small chamber beneath the stone flooring, approximately 6 feet long by 3 feet wide. The space contained only damp soil and several corroded metal objects that Weathers identified as candle holders, and what might have been medical or surgical implements, though their advanced state of deterioration made positive identification impossible. Most curious was a circular arrangement of small holes drilled into the surrounding stone, as if something had once been affixed to the walls of this hidden chamber. Weathers also discovered evidence that a portion of the north wall in the cellar had been dismantled and rebuilt at some point, with the newer stonework clearly distinguishable from the original construction. Behind this wall was a narrow space containing what Weathers described as unusual markings, carved into the original foundation stones. His notes include detailed sketches of these markings, which he compared to various folk protection symbols known in Appalachian communities, though he noted they did not precisely match any documented examples. The space behind the wall extended upward through the structure of the house, forming a narrow shaft that would have run alongside several rooms on both the first and second floors. At each of the 4 locations marked on the boundaries of the property, Weathers found similar disturbances in the soil, suggesting items had been buried and later removed. In one location, he discovered a small metal box containing soil that laboratory analysis later identified as not native to Kentucky, containing mineral compositions more commonly found in eastern Pennsylvania. The most disturbing discovery, however, was made at the location marked furthest from the house, near the edge of the woods at the northern boundary of the property. Here, Weathers uncovered a small metal box containing a leather-bound book with no writing on its cover. The book contained no text, only dozens of intricate drawings in what appeared to be various natural inks or stains. The first page bore a symbol matching the one from Samuel's notebook and the wax seal on the document box. The drawings depicted human figures in various rigid poses, often standing among trees or in doorways. In many of the images, the figures' faces were either blank or contained too many features, eyes where there should not be eyes, mouths depicted as dark vertical slashes. Later pages showed interior scenes of what appeared to be the Miller house, with elongated shadows stretching from corners and doorways, often seemingly independent of any visible source of light. One particularly unsettling sequence of drawings showed a figure standing in the cellar, gradually reaching into or through the north wall, its arm elongating impossibly with each subsequent image. In the final drawing of this sequence, the figure had somehow passed entirely into the wall, with only a hand remaining visible, seemingly beckoning. The final pages of the book contained increasingly abstract images that Weathers described as suggesting a gradual dissolution of form and perspective. The very last drawing showed 5 identical figures, standing in a circle, facing outward, with a 6th figure in the center, its back arched at an impossible angle. The colleagues' response, dated March 12, 1957, suggested the drawings exhibited characteristics consistent with the documented visual productions of individuals suffering from certain forms of shared psychosis or extreme parasomnia. However, the colleague also noted peculiarities in the composition and execution that were difficult to reconcile with known psychological conditions. The letter continued, "Most striking is the consistency of perspective and technique across what appear to be multiple artists, suggesting either a remarkable degree of shared perceptual distortion or some common external stimulus." Around this image was written a single phrase in a spidery hand: "The door opens both ways." Weathers sent the book to a colleague at the University of Chicago for analysis. The progressive abstraction in later images follows a pattern we've observed in cases of sensory deprivation, where the mind begins to deconstruct visual reality when starved of normal input. I would be interested to know the specific circumstances under which these images were produced, particularly whether the artists were engaging in any practices known to alter consciousness. Further analysis of the book was prevented when it was destroyed in a small fire in Weathers' office in April 1957. According to the university's incident report, the fire appeared to have started in the metal box itself, though no cause was determined. Weathers' detailed photographs of the drawings were also lost in the fire, leaving only his written descriptions and a few rough sketches in his research notes. The report notes that Weathers was found staring at the smoldering remains when colleagues responded to the smoke, apparently in a state of shock, repeatedly murmuring, "It doesn't want to be seen." In the months following this incident, Weathers' colleagues reported he became increasingly withdrawn and focused on the Miller case to the exclusion of his teaching and other research responsibilities. His office walls became covered with maps, timelines, and photographs of the Miller property and surrounding area. He frequently traveled to Boone County, staying for days at a time in a small rented room in Burlington. The landlady later reported that Weathers rarely slept during these visits, keeping lights burning throughout the night and covering all mirrors in his room with cloth. A colleague who visited Weathers in late 1957 described finding his university office in a state of extreme disorder, with papers covering every surface and strange symbols drawn on the windows in what appeared to be red ink. When questioned about his research, Weathers reportedly spoke in fragmented sentences about thin places and doors that should stay closed. He claimed to have identified similar cases throughout the Appalachian region, spanning more than a century, all involving isolated properties where families reported phenomena similar to those experienced by the Millers before disappearing or dying under mysterious circumstances. According to Weathers' final research notes, dated January 1958, he had developed a theory that the Miller family had been engaged in some form of psychological experiment or spiritual practice that opened a door not easily closed. He referenced several obscure European texts dealing with sensory deprivation and its effects on perception, as well as certain folk practices from the Pennsylvania Dutch communities where Thomas Miller had originated. One passage reads, "The Millers did not merely observe phenomena, they actively cultivated it through specific architectural modifications and ritual practices derived from Thomas's ancestral tradition. The narrow spaces within walls, the alignment of doors, the positioning of mirrors, all created deliberate points of perceptual instability that, when combined with certain meditative states, were believed to thin the boundary between seen and unseen realities. Weathers had begun experimenting with acoustic phenomena in spaces similar to the one he had discovered in the Miller cellar. His notes describe constructing a small chamber in his basement with specific proportions that, he claimed, created standing wave patterns capable of inducing altered perceptual states. When the dimensions are precisely calculated, he wrote, the resulting resonance creates not just auditory, but proprioceptive anomalies. One begins to perceive space differently, as if certain angles and distances no longer conform to Euclidean geometry. This distortion of spatial perception may be what the Millers described as it watching from between the walls, not an entity as such, but a perceptual window into a space that obeys different physical laws. Weathers' last documented visit to the Miller property was in February 1958. A colleague who drove him to the site later reported that Weathers had been carrying specialized equipment borrowed from the university's physics department, including what was described as some sort of sound recording or measuring device. Weathers asked to be left at the property alone, arranging to be picked up the following morning. He was described as unusually calm and focused, in contrast to his agitated state in previous weeks. When his colleague returned the next day, Weathers was nowhere to be found. His equipment remained set up in what had once been the Miller house cellar, apparently functioning normally, though the recording device contained only static. A thorough search by local authorities found no trace of Weathers in the surrounding area. His disappearance remains unsolved. The investigation into Weathers' disappearance uncovered one final piece of the Miller puzzle. Among Weathers' personal effects was a sealed envelope addressed to the university president, containing a single page with the following typewritten message. I believe I understand what happened to the Miller family. They didn't leave. They were still in the house when Jeremiah Tanner entered on November 12, 1885. They were present but not visible. The sixth place at the table wasn't set for an expected guest. It was set for whatever had been living between the walls. The Millers opened something and couldn't close it. I found the same opening. May God forgive my curiosity. The university administration, concerned about potential damage to the institution's reputation, quietly shelved Weathers' research. His disappearance was officially attributed to a possible hiking accident, though no body was ever recovered. The materials he had collected were stored in the university archives, where they remained largely forgotten until 1968, when a basement flood damaged many of the documents. A curious footnote to Weathers' disappearance emerged in 1962, when a surveyor working in the woods near the former Miller property reported finding a set of clothing neatly folded at the base of a large oak tree. The items matched the description of what Weathers had been wearing when last seen, yet despite their apparent exposure to 4 years of weather, they were described as being in remarkably good condition, appearing almost new. No other trace of Weathers was discovered, and the clothing was eventually returned to his family. What survived of the Miller documents was catalogued by a graduate student in 1969 as part of a broader project on Kentucky folklore. The student's notes mention the Miller case only briefly, describing it as an apparent instance of folie à plusieurs shared psychosis among an isolated family group, resulting in their flight or possible suicide. The materials were subsequently filed away in the university's special collections, accessible only to researchers with specific permission. The graduate student's personal diary, discovered after her death in 2011, contained a more candid assessment. The Miller materials disturb me in ways I cannot articulate. The journal entries describing sounds in the walls remind me uncomfortably of experiences in my own apartment, which I had attributed to normal settling noises. Since working with these documents, I have begun to question whether my own perception is entirely reliable. Last night I woke convinced someone was standing in my bedroom doorway, though when I turned on the light, no one was there. I will be glad when this cataloging project is complete. In 1972, the last standing structures on the original Miller property were demolished to make way for agricultural development. According to county records, the construction crew reported unusual difficulties, including equipment failures and unexplained accidents that resulted in the project being delayed several months. The foreman's log contains a curious entry noting that during excavation of the old cellar area, the air became unbearably still, like the pressure before a terrible storm, though the sky remained clear. One worker reportedly quit after claiming to see someone watching from the edge of the woods, a tall figure that disappeared when approached. Another described hearing what sounded like whispering coming from inside a sealed section of foundation wall. The crew eventually refused to work during late afternoon hours, claiming the site became unfriendly as the sun began to set. The land has remained farmland since then, though local farmers report that crops grow poorly in certain areas of the former Miller property, particularly in a roughly circular section near where the house once stood. Soil samples taken in 1983 showed no obvious contamination or deficiency that would explain this phenomenon. Infrared aerial photography conducted in 1987 as part of an agricultural study revealed unusual temperature variations in these areas, with the unproductive soil registering consistently colder than surrounding land, regardless of season or time of day. In 1991, a graduate student in folklore studies attempted to revive interest in the Miller case, conducting interviews with elderly residents of Boone County who had grown up hearing stories about the disappearance. Most accounts had evolved into standard rural legends involving murders, hidden treasure, or supernatural elements clearly added over decades of retelling. However, one interview subject, a 94-year-old woman named Constance Mather, provided an account that aligned eerily with some of the details from Thomas Miller's journal. Mather claimed that her grandfather had been one of the deputies involved in the original investigation and had shared certain observations with family members that never appeared in official reports. According to Mather, her grandfather described entering the Miller house and experiencing an overwhelming sensation as if the air itself was watching. He also claimed to have seen movement in his peripheral vision throughout the investigation, though nothing was ever there when he turned to look. Most strikingly, he reported that when the search party first entered the house, all the mirrors had been covered with cloth, and a circle of salt surrounded the dining table where the half-eaten meal was found. Grandfather said the strangest thing was the cold, Mather recounted. It was November, yes. But inside that house was a cold that seemed to come from the walls themselves. He described it as hungry cold, which I never understood until I felt something similar in a hospital room just before my mother passed. It was as if the cold was waiting for something. He also mentioned that none of the men wanted to enter the cellar. They drew straws, and the poor fellow who lost came back up white as a sheet, refusing to describe what he'd seen down there. All he would say was, "The wall breathes." Mather also recalled her grandfather mentioning that Sheriff Collins had removed certain items from the house before it was officially documented, including a small wooden box and several books that he considered unwholesome. According to family lore, Collins stored these items somewhere in the courthouse, as he believed burning them would bring misfortune. This account potentially explains how Thomas Miller's journal and other documents came to be discovered in the courthouse attic decades later. The graduate student's research was never completed, as funding for the project was withdrawn following a departmental reorganization. Her preliminary notes were filed with the university's existing Miller materials, where they remained until 2002, when a historian researching rural Kentucky life in the late 19th century came across them by chance. This historian, Dr. Eleanor Braddock, became fascinated by the Miller case and spent several years attempting to piece together the fragmented information that remained. In her unpublished manuscript, Silence and Shadows, The Miller Family Disappearance, Braddock proposed that the family had fallen victim to what she termed environmental psychosis, a condition where geographic isolation, possible environmental toxins, and family dynamics created a perfect storm of psychological deterioration. Braddock pointed to several similar cases in rural America during the same period, where isolated families developed shared delusions and paranoia. She suggested the unusual sounds the Millers reported might have been caused by subsidence beneath the house, possibly releasing pockets of gas that could cause auditory hallucinations or perceptual disturbances. The cold spots and strange sensations could be attributed to unusual air currents created by the house's structure, particularly the hidden spaces Weathers had discovered within the walls. The Millers created their own haunting, Braddock wrote, through a combination of architectural anomalies, isolation-induced stress, and possibly Thomas Miller's pre-existing mental instability. The family's background in Pennsylvania Dutch country, with its rich tradition of folk magic and boundary symbols, provided a cultural framework for interpreting their experiences in supernatural terms rather than psychological ones. The more they focused on these experiences, the more pronounced they became, creating a feedback loop of perceptual distortion that eventually led to some form of shared psychotic break. However, Braddock's manuscript also acknowledged certain elements of the case that resisted conventional explanation, particularly the sixth-place setting at the table and the rebuilt cellar wall. She noted that Thomas Miller's background in Pennsylvania Dutch country might have exposed him to folk practices involving the deliberate creation of spirit rooms, concealed spaces within a house designed to trap or contain negative influences. Some traditional Pennsylvania Dutch homes featured such architectural oddities based on the belief that certain entities could be contained or misdirected through carefully designed spatial anomalies. Braddock also addressed the strange circumstances of Professor Weathers's disappearance, suggesting that his intense immersion in the Miller case might have created a form of contagious delusion in which he began to experience phenomena similar to those he was researching. The power of suggestion, combined with sleep deprivation and possible undiagnosed mental health issues, could have led Weathers to perceive threats or presences that existed only in his mind, she wrote. His disappearance might represent a tragic case of suicide driven by delusion rather than anything connected to supernatural forces. In her conclusion, Braddock wrote, "While natural and psychological explanations account for much of what transpired at the Miller farm, certain aspects of the case suggest the family believed themselves to be dealing with something beyond rational understanding." She declined several opportunities to speak publicly about the case, and in a 2009 interview with a local newspaper about her broader historical research, she refused to discuss the Miller disappearance, stating only that some stories are better left untold. Her personal notes, discovered after her retirement in 2015, revealed she had experienced several unsettling incidents while researching the Miller case, including persistent dreams of narrow spaces and cold air, and the sensation of being watched while working late in her office. Whether their perception was accurate or delusional remains impossible to determine with certainty. Braddock's manuscript was completed in 2007, but remains unpublished. A colleague who had reviewed Braddock's manuscript reported finding a handwritten note on the final page that was not included in the official draft. "I no longer believe they were delusional. I think they knew exactly what they were doing. The question isn't what happened to the Millers, it's why they wanted it to happen." The property where the Miller house once stood was purchased by a development company in 2014, with plans to construct a small subdivision. Initial surveys were conducted, but construction has been repeatedly delayed due to permit issues and financing problems. Local rumors suggest workers have reported unusual phenomena on the site, including equipment malfunctions, unexplained cold spots, and a persistent sensation of being observed. As of 1968, the land remained vacant, with local residents generally avoiding the area, particularly after dark. One surveyor, speaking anonymously to a local newspaper in 2016, described an unsettling experience. We were marking out lot boundaries near where the old farmhouse supposedly stood, and I kept feeling like someone was standing right behind me. Every time I turned around, nothing was there. Then I noticed my colleague, who was about 50 yards away, kept looking over his shoulder too. At one point we both stopped and stared at each other, and I knew he was feeling the same thing. The strangest part was when we compared notes later. We both kept seeing something in our peripheral vision, always in the same spot near the edge of the woods. One final note about the Miller case comes from an unexpected source. In 1963, during renovations to the old Burlington Presbyterian Church, workers discovered a small metal box sealed inside a wall near the altar. The box contained a single sheet of paper with what appeared to be a prayer or plea written in Thomas Miller's distinctive handwriting. It has found a way in. We hear it in the walls, see it in the corners of our vision. It sits at our table, though we cannot see it clearly. We have tried the old ways to seal it out, but I fear we have only drawn its attention more fully upon us. If you find this, pray for us, but do not seek us. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. The paper was turned over to the County Historical Society, where it was briefly displayed before being removed from exhibition due to complaints from several visitors who reported feeling intensely uncomfortable while viewing it. The document was subsequently placed in storage, where it presumably remains today. The curator who made the decision to remove the document later commented, "There was nothing overtly disturbing about the text itself. It was the reaction it provoked in people that concerned us." Several visitors reported feeling suddenly cold while reading it, and one elderly woman became quite distressed, claiming she could hear faint scratching sounds coming from behind the display case. In a curious postscript to this incident, the renovation worker who discovered the box reported a series of strange occurrences in his home following the discovery. According to a statement given to the Historical Society, he experienced unusual cold spots, the sensation of being watched, and strange sounds in the walls for several weeks after handling the box. These phenomena reportedly ceased after he attended a church service and prayed specifically for protection from whatever might have followed me home. The Miller family disappearance stands as one of Kentucky's most enduring mysteries. 5 adults vanishing overnight, leaving behind no bodies, no signs of violence, and no clear explanation. Were they victims of some undocumented crime? Did they flee in the grip of shared delusion? Or, as some of the more sensationalistic accounts suggest, did they encounter something in that remote farmhouse that defied conventional understanding? What we know with certainty is that on November 12, 1885, Jeremiah Tanner found an empty house with a half-eaten meal, doors unlocked, and a table set for 6 when only 5 should have been present. Everything else remains speculation, fragments of evidence, and whispered stories that still circulate in Boone County more than a century later. A local folklore researcher who has studied the case extensively offers perhaps the most unsettling interpretation. The Millers didn't disappear in the conventional sense. They found what they were looking for, a way to exist in the spaces between conventional reality. The 6th place at the table wasn't for an external entity. It was for whoever would take their place once they had gone. The real question is whether Professor Weathers found his way to where they went, or whether something else found its way back through the door he reopened. Perhaps it is fitting that both the Millers and Professor Weathers, the man who most deeply investigated their disappearance, vanished without trace. Some mysteries, it seems, resist resolution. Some stories continue to echo long after those who lived them have disappeared into silence. It is said that the current owners of the land occasionally report unusual sounds at night, a rhythmic scratching that seems to come from underground, where the Miller cellar once stood. They describe it as almost deliberate in its pacing, like something trying to communicate. Or perhaps, as Thomas Miller wrote in his final journal entry, like something watching and waiting from between the walls. If you find yourself driving through rural Boone County, you might pass a small creek that still bears the Miller name, though few remember why. The locals will tell you not to linger there after dark. Not because they believe in ghosts or monsters, but because something about the quality of silence in that place feels watchful, expectant, as if the air itself is holding its breath, waiting for someone to finally hear what it has been trying to say for over a century. And perhaps that is the most disturbing aspect of the Miller family disappearance. Not that they vanished without explanation, but that somewhere, somehow, they might still be present, just beyond the corner of our vision, just behind the walls, watching and waiting for someone to set the sixth place at the table once again. Residents living near the former Miller property have reported occasional peculiarities over the decades, unexplained cold spots that persist even in summer heat, electronic devices that malfunction without apparent cause, and perhaps most unsettling, dreams of narrow spaces and watching eyes that seem to affect multiple household members simultaneously. One family who rented a house built near the site in the 1990s moved out after just 4 months, citing a persistent feeling of intrusion that no amount of rational explanation could dispel. In 2013, a paranormal investigation team requested permission to conduct research at the site. Their equipment reportedly recorded significant temperature fluctuations and unusual electromagnetic readings, particularly in the area where the Miller cellar had once been located. Most striking were audio recordings that seemed to contain faint whispers, just at the threshold of audibility. When digitally enhanced, one segment appeared to contain the words "between the walls," repeated 3 times, though audio experts who later analyzed the recording suggested it was likely the result of wind interference or equipment malfunction. The investigator who conducted this research later abandoned the paranormal field entirely, citing personal reasons. In a private email to a colleague, obtained by researchers in 2017, she wrote, "What we found at the Miller site wasn't evidence of conventional haunting. It was something else entirely, a kind of thinning of normal perceptual boundaries. I can't explain it scientifically, but I no longer believe we were documenting external phenomena. I think we were recording the effects of that place on our own minds, and I no longer want to know what's causing those effects." Local historians continued to debate the Miller case, with opinions divided between those who favor conventional explanations, murder, flight, or mental illness, and those who believe something truly anomalous occurred. What remains undisputed is the unusual concentration of strange incidents and disappearances connected to the property and those who have investigated it. As one local historian put it in a 2018 interview, "Whether you believe in the supernatural or not, the Miller case presents a genuine historical mystery. 5 adults don't simply vanish without leaving some trace unless they very much wanted to disappear, or unless something wanted them to disappear." The truly unsettling aspect is how the case seems to affect those who study it too closely. It's as if the story itself is somehow contagious, spreading from the Millers to Weathers to Braddock and beyond. Each researcher finds themselves experiencing phenomena similar to what they're investigating. At what point does scholarly interest become dangerous obsession? The Miller family disappearance remains officially unsolved, a footnote in county records, and an occasional feature in books about historical mysteries. Yet, for those who have encountered the story directly through documents or visits to the site, it often becomes something more personal and disquieting, a reminder that even in our modern world of rational explanations and scientific certainty, some corners of human experience remain stubbornly resistant to simple categorization. As Thomas Miller wrote in his final known communication, hidden in a church wall and discovered decades after his disappearance, "Some doors once opened cannot be closed again. Whether those doors exist in old farmhouses or in the human mind remains, perhaps deliberately, unanswered." And so, the Miller mystery endures, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a cautionary tale about the places where the familiar world grows thin, where what we think we know about reality proves insufficient, and where the boundaries we take for granted, between presence and absence, between observation and participation, between walls that separate and walls that connect, may not be as solid as we prefer to believe.